and Ed Tobin, discussing Kaplan, his theology, and his God. If you would all please hold your questions until the end, we shall start now.
So Ed, I'm going to do what Jill and Ketzel did last week. How did you become a Reconstructionist?
Let's see, I came out of college with some sort of a need for a non-dual image of the divine. And when we got back to Denver, it seemed like Reconstructionism might have been the only place where I could have a belief like that and still be Jewish. And good friends of ours were in the Reconstructionists. We talked to them about it. They said we could start in an orientation group if we had commitment. So Bobby and I discussed being committed for about a couple of years. And then we finally decided, we're never really going to be able to say we're committed. We just went for it. So here we are. I'm very happy.
So you want to know how I became a Reconstructionist?
We're in your party, Ed.
So one day I was sitting in my law office at this big law firm, and I get a call from a woman who's now a Colorado judge who I didn't know at the time. And she said, Sandy, you were referred by somebody that we both know, and I belong to this congregation, and we have a personnel issue that we could really use some help with. I was doing employment law. And I said, sure, I always did a lot of pro bono work. Oh, she said pro bono. So, of course. So the guy who was the incoming chair of this organization came to my office, and he started talking about Reconstructionists, and I said, wasn't that something that happened after the Civil War? And said something about a Havurah, and I said, could you spell that, please? And so I knew nothing. I worked with the personnel committee. I was very impressed. I was invited to come to high holiday services where I think Bobby was playing the guitar. There was no rabbi. It was lay-led, and I said, I want to join. And they said, well, first come to these orientation sessions. And before that happened, I was given a packet of materials to read. And I'm reading about how this guy Kaplan didn't believe in an anthropomorphic kind of God. And I said, oh, I can deal with that. And he didn't believe that the Jews were chosen people. And I said, oh, I think that's where I belong. And here I am. So it's going to give us a little prologue before we start talking about Kaplan's ambivalent relationship with God.
And I do want to thank you for coming. And as long as I'm expressing gratitude, I think I'll say that another thing I'm really grateful for is the enthusiasm of the people in the class. It's been really gratifying to come to class, have fun, have good discussions, have people get excited, and here we are, and this is the result of that excitement, enthusiasm. I'm also very grateful to Mordecai Kaplan for his audacious and radical thinking and writing, because if it hadn't been for Kaplan, I'm not sure where I would be right now, probably in some ashram in Longmont or something like that. Where's Jill? Probably be up there milking goats, only for a living. And also I don't know if they're, were you guys part of the original Havurah, Janet? So Janet and Art and the rest of the people who formed Havurah, which was really a group of people, energetic and I'll say wise people, that brought the practice of Reconstructionist Judaism to Denver by forming the first Havurah, and then some 6-7 years later, Bobby and I joined. So I do thank you, because if it hadn't been for you, I truly would not be here. Now, last week we heard about Kaplan's beginnings and his influences. And Ketzel and Jill touched on a lot of his early influences, and they talked about the fact that he was born in 1881 in,
Lithuania.
yeah, but Svensjan, okay, Lithuania, which was not an inconsequential little town, and it was sort of, there were a lot of Jewish energy going on in Svensjan. During the 19th century, the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, had been surging through Europe. There were leftovers from the false messiahs, Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank, that were still there in Svensjan. Zionism was perking along. There were debates there between the Hasidim who believed that you could unite with God and worship God through ecstatic singing and dancing, and they were opposed by the folks called the Nagadim, which means the adversaries, who believed that the only way to approach God was through fervent observant of the mitzvot and study. So they were really at odds, and also at the time I think Musar was very active in Svensjan. So and also I think it was something that had to do with why the Kaplan family left Svensjan. In addition to the fact that I guess Mordecai Kaplan's father was getting a job in New York, but in 1881 when Mordecai was born, and by the way his name, I can't remember where I read this, but he was called Muttle.
T.T. Muttle?
Muttle.
Muddle,
Yeah.
like Muddle the tailor and
Yeah.
Fiddler on the
The year Muttle was born, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And part of the reaction to that were anti-Semitic violence and pogroms, and some of that actually got to Svensjan as well. So it wasn't really a comfortable place to be. And it was a place of let's say all of the Pale of Settlements was a place of great flux and energy and change. So when Muttle was 7 or 8 years old, they left to come to the United States, and they spent a year in Paris on the way. And 1889, I remember this was the only thing that sunk in for my history of architecture class, was the year of a great universal exposition in Paris that the Eiffel Tower was built as the signature structure for. And there is a story that Muttle and his would play under the Eiffel Tower while his mother sold cookies there. And I haven't read so, but I would imagine that he also visited some of the exhibits. You know, there were giant exhibit halls with all kinds of exhibits. And so let's just imagine that this is what he saw when he was at the exposition. First of all, he saw an electrified city. Paris was known as the City of Lights, City of Light. They had electric trams. The Eiffel Tower had an electric elevator. The design of the Eiffel Tower was not, as many buildings were designed at the time, set up as a background for ornamentation. It was designed merely to, and grandly, to satisfy the resolution of the wind forces that were working against this tower, and so that's why the shape is the way it is. The wind followed the stresses down and were distributed into the ground. Well, this was unheard of. You know, to think that the form of a structure could actually have to do with the forces and the functions that were part of the structure's purpose. He saw power machinery. He saw inventions. He saw different cultures. There were, I was surfing the web, and there were dancers from Java, you know, and he saw the progress of technical invention, and not to forget that 30 years before this, Darwin had published The Origin of Species, and so evolution was a big, big idea, and evolution was something that was focused on in the exposition, looking at how different cultures, different civilizations had evolved. And here are Javanese dancers, you know, this is the stage that they're in, or whatever. And Kaplan, I think, had the idea that from this, and I'll give him the idea, that everything evolves, that everything is changing, everything is developing. He later on, this was a big part of his belief, that Judaism, he finally formulated, was the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, the evolving religious civilization. You know, he came to believe that peoples can evolve, ideas can evolve, divinity can evolve. The idea of God evolved from believing that what brought the thunder and lightning from the sky was a being up there that could be appealed to and could be possibly controlled for bringing the rain when it was needed, or maybe protection from the lightning. Trees, mountains were divine. You know, water, rivers, natural forces were divine, and then these divinities became personified as gods, and they were given human sort of characteristics. They were seen as human entities, and then there were councils of gods, pantheons that would act, and then the individual gods would act as well, and eventually the idea of monotheism came about, that there was one God of gods, that was the God, and this was where we ended up, you know, with the Jewish belief of monotheism. And it was not an original belief. It, you know, there were Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Sumerians, whatever, that also had this belief that there was one superior being. And finally, according to Kaplan, Kaplan's definition, the God, our biblical God, was a God of miracles, and then eventually the God of freedom. And that was the God that Kaplan liked to refer to. So they got to the U.S., and I'm not sure what the culture was in Svensson, but here they come to the U.S., and as Muffle evolves, okay, his name evolves, becomes Max, okay, and then it's Maurice, and then finally, and I don't know when all this happened, it ends up as Mordecai. So, you know, as he's learning to be an American and to assimilate, or, you know, to learn how to live in this civilization and in two civilizations eventually, he sees that this is a democratic structure. You're not a leader by anointment by God. You're elected by the people. You're not part of a dynasty. In fact, it's very important for the common people, the citizens, to be participators in this whole process. That this was a civilization that was based and aspired on equality, that between leaders and communities and the members of the community. It was a culture that, I'll say, aspired to separating church and state. That you could belong to any religion legally in this country and not be subjugated. Let's hope that's true. This was a country where diversity was celebrated.
Except today.
What?
Except today.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know. Anyway, all religions, ethnic groups, and whatever were, if not welcomed, let's say at least tolerated, respected to some degree. And I think what was obvious at some point to Mordecai was that the divine blessing came from many directions and wasn't the property of exclusively one people or one group. And so part of that was learning to live in two civilizations, which is an important element in Reconstructionist thought. So he came out of this early experience, or let's say sometime in his whole experience, with the main question was, how were Jews and Judaism to adjust to the changed conditions of life in the U.S. in the present period, in his period, in our period, as far as that goes. Because he had come from a very, very different culture. When he was, I'm guessing, fairly young, as Jill and Ketzel mentioned last week, their home was visited by Arnold Ehrlich, a radical thinking Bible critic. And Mordecai learned about Bible criticism from Ehrlich. And he learned that the Bible was not written by God, it was written by people, that there were many authors, that the authors came from different cultures, that the Bible was a compilation of stories, of different stories, of myths, of legends, and that it's literature. But the religion and let's say superstition and the belief in the supernatural was, at the time, before the advent of, let's say, modern science, the religion and superstition were the best religion we had. They were the best answers to the large questions. Where does this come from? Why does this happen? Why am I here? What happens afterwards? In the schools that he attended, he studied and was familiar with the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, the study of humans, the study of the processes by which humans grew, behaved, related to each other, understood that those were processes. And he rejected supernaturalism as a basis for knowledge. Emerson said, and Emerson was a great influence on Kaplan, what needs to be done must be done by humans, not relying on supernatural forces. And I think that even the exposition when Mordecai was maybe 7, 8 years old, I think was a big example of that. And so he developed, in his teens, basically. He was still a teenager, I think, when he graduated college. The need for an understanding of the divine, an understanding of God, that is what we're going to be discussing tonight. But I think it came fairly early, and he was at, I think he was about 30 when he was really starting to lecture and travel around the country. He was well known as a lecturer before college groups. It was called the Menorah Society. So, Sandy, what can you tell us about Kaplan and his multi-layered God thoughts?
So Kaplan's views on God, like much of his thinking, are complex and multi-layered. He was not an atheist. Okay, we talked about that a little bit last week, but he was not an atheist. Mel Scult, who wrote the book that we've been studying, writes that Kaplan was God-obsessed. He thought about God all the time. His concept of God was different from that of most people, but he fiercely defended the presence of God. Last week we heard about how Spinoza was such an influence on Kaplan, and like Spinoza, Kaplan dismissed the idea of a supernatural God very early in his life. He rejected the idea of a God who concerns himself with human beings, who directs history, and who lays down laws for us to follow. He didn't believe in a God that feels or has will, that speaks to anyone or listens, that rewards and punishes. It follows, therefore, that he did not believe in a God that chose the Jewish people from among the nations to be his people and his special concern. And if you come to the last session, I hope you all do, Ed's going to talk a bit more about the idea of chosenness and why Kaplan rejected it. You are going to do that, aren't you?
Yes.
Yes, you. It's a promise. So in the book, Mel Scult talks about this idea this way. He said, to impute communication to the divine in any sense is an anthropomorphic sin of the highest degree. And we all know what anthropomorphic means. It's something that has human traits, emotions, intentions. That's not Kaplan's God. Kaplan never equivocates on this issue, Scult wrote. God does not have a voice, does not speak, and does not formulate any laws, whether those have to do with priestly purity or with the proper place of homosexuals in society or any other laws. Kaplan would say that the notion of God's communicating is simply a reflection of the primitive Israelite mind. One of the steps toward our own intellectual maturity would be to accept the fact that such an expression is entirely poetic and metaphorical. But those are Mel Scult's words. Unfortunately, though Kaplan's stand on this issue is crystal clear, he was never able to act fully on his belief. In 1945, he published his Sabbath prayer book. And in there, we find Kaplan referring to God in a personal sense and using the expression, "Blessed art thou," in addressing God. Scult suggests that this rather confusing fact is partially due to his lack of poetic ability rather than any equivocation about God's nature. Perhaps the age-old habit of belief in a personal God could not be given up 100%. As Jill told us last week, he was a good Jewish boy who came from this Orthodox background, and he couldn't give those words up. Nonetheless, though Kaplan used the words of the personal address to the divine, it is manifestly clear that his foundational theological commitments are naturalistic and not supernatural. Of that, we can be certain. If there's anything about Kaplan and God, we know that that's true. Kaplan was also a naturalist who believed that God was manifest in the order of nature. And we'll hear more about that. We'll hear his own words. You'll hear his own voice about that when we finish. So now I'm going to give it back to Ed to talk a bit about Kaplan's functional approach and divine as a process.
So I mentioned how important it was to focus on the function of things, especially in early 20th century, in the design field for sure. Form follows function. You know, that's what we were taught, and I still believe it. But he chose to dwell on the way God functions in the world, rather than to try to fathom the metaphysical problem of his essence, which I really appreciate because I don't know, metaphysics is a tough field. He was a pragmatist in his lifelong quest for meaning of God, and he always focused on what God helps people to do. He said it matters very little how we conceive of God as long as our belief makes a tremendous difference in our lives. So, you know, that's big. It doesn't really matter how we conceive of God or the divine, as I would like to say, as long as it makes a tremendous difference in our lives. And he said that we make no philosophical or metaphysical commitments when we identify the nature of a thing or an idea or of a divine entity with the manner in which it functions, with the difference it makes in other things. That's how he evaluates the value of a belief or of something. He said, God is that aspect of reality which elicits from us the best that is in us and enables us to bear the worst that can befall us. 1933. And then 40 years later, he stated, God is the assumption that there is enough in the world to meet men's needs, but not their greeds for power and pleasure. And at the same time, or maybe earlier, that very same statement, there is enough in the world to meet men's needs, but not their greeds, was stated by Mahatma Gandhi. Great minds. His emphasis on practical, functional conception of God was consistent with his rejection of all supernatural beliefs that are inconsistent with modern science. This would mean emphasizing connection with God, communion with God, rather than belief in God. And to know that the belief needs to make a tremendous difference in our lives.
So Ed, I want to stop you there,
Okay,
because that was a direct quote from Kaplan.
yes.
He said, it matters very little how we conceive of God, as long as our belief makes a tremendous difference in our lives. So I have a question. Does this leave open the possibility for some to conceive of God in personal terms as one who listens to us?
You're asking me?
I'm asking you.
I think that just by looking around, I think that we have to know that that sort of belief in God is a very, very powerful force in society. And there's, I don't happen to go that way, but I see that many people get comfort from that. They find guidance, in that sort of belief. They get their moral and ethical, basis from that kind of belief. And so, I say, look, if it works for them, and they're good people, okay, then I say that's good. It's a good thing.
So Reconstructionism is a big tent.
Well, we know that, I mean, our community is a pretty good sized tent. I think the range of theological belief in our community ranges all the way from, as I do not subscribing to the supernatural hypothesis, to not subscribing to the supernatural hypothesis. I'm sorry. I joke, of course. So,
Let's talk about divine as process.
okay, all right. So I mentioned that Kaplan was aware of process, I'm imagining, at an early age. He spoke of God as a process. In 1931, he wrote in his diary, "I know very well what I mean by God. God to me is the process that makes for creation." And then 21 years later, in the diary entry 52, he wrote, "When we say God loves, forgives, acts justly, we should understand it to mean that the process of loving, forgiving, and acting justly are divine or godly." And that's a big thing, okay? God is not doing these things, but to act that way, to behave this way, is a godly, or I'll say a goodly way of behaving. He says, what are life, knowledge, goodness, if not processes? Since godliness is life, knowledge, and goodness, what else can God be than process? This is Kaplan. Loyalty or love, responsibility, integrity, and creativity are manifestations in human life of cosmic processes. He believes they're cosmic. In their mutual interaction in the life of human individuals and societies, cosmic processes impel and help people to strive for perfection, fulfillment, or salvation. God or divinity is experienced as the power that makes for salvation or the fulfillment of destiny. I'd like to look at that just piece by piece, okay? God, now usually we hear God is the process that makes for salvation. But the statement really was, he envisions God as the process that makes for salvation. There's a big difference there, okay? He's talking metaphor here. God as the process. And when we say God is the process, then that's something, that's maybe a fact, not a metaphor. I would like to think of it more as a fact. But okay, so God, and I'm going to say it that way, God is the process that makes for salvation. Process is not capitalized, or the power. God is the power that makes for salvation. Power is not capitalized. It doesn't mean a political power, a big strong person, a whatever. I'm looking at power, I define this, I parse this as we see power in physics as a measure of the ability to do work, to act. Okay, so God is the capacity to act, that makes for salvation. Makes for means create. And salvation is Kaplan's sort of heavily loaded word for self-fulfillment, as Priscilla's going to get into next week. So God is the power that makes for salvation. In my interpretation is that our most fundamental process is the capacity that makes for creativity and fulfillment in life. And I can live with that. I think that's good. Referring to the divine to explain justice and mercy as divine is really to talk about ourselves and what we must do. That is, be just and be merciful. Indeed, even the most traditional believer would agree that when we refer to the attributes of God, it is only through human effort that these qualities become operative in the world, as Emerson said. In short, there is no justice until we are just. There is no mercy until we are merciful. Next.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk about immanence, that's with an I, and transcendence. And before I do that, some definitions, because I always get confused with those words. What do they mean? So immanent means indwelling, inherent, being within the limits of possible experience or knowledge. That's a dictionary definition.
Could you do it one more time?
Immanence, indwelling, inherent, being within the limits of possible experience or knowledge. Said another way, immanence refers to those philosophical and metaphysical theories of divine presence in which the divine encompasses or is manifested in the material world. Stuff that's right here.
God in the world.
God in the world, it's
Immanence.
right here. It's, concrete, it's in the world, it's what's here. Transcendence, on the other hand, means exceeding usual limits, extending or lying beyond the limits of ordinary experience, being beyond comprehension. Okay? Immanence is more concrete, transcendence is out there.
A transcendent God is God above the world.
So, though Kaplan often attempts to confine the divine within our own human lives, he never dismisses the transcendent. He said, the moment God is merely identified with the world and conceived as being immanent but not transcendent, his divinity is denied and he is dissolved into the world. This is the atheism and pantheism which religion so vigorously contends against.
Who said that, Sandy?
So you want the quote from Kaplan again.
Yeah.
The moment God is merely identified with the world and conceived as being immanent but not transcendent, his divinity is denied, and he, notice he calls God he all the time, which bothers some of us, right, Pat? And he is dissolved into the world. This is the atheism and pantheism which religion so vigorously contends against. Even as he focused on means and ends and human fulfillment, he nevertheless insists that such an emphasis would in no way detract from the mystery of experience or in any way lessen our reverence and wonderment in the presence of the unfathomable. We must be careful, Kaplan adds, not to reduce God to the ethical or the communal. So we heard a lot about ethics last week, but there's more than that in his view of God. So now we're going to get all of you involved. We've put together a whole bunch of quotes from Kaplan about his definitions of God. And that's not the piece of paper that was on the table. We're going to pass these out.
Just take one. One thing I forgot to share was Kaplan's inconsistencies, his contradictions, his very much whatever. It just used to drive me crazy. There's a bunch of them. Is everybody getting one of these?
They're coming.
What happened? Here's some. Just used to drive me crazy, but I have to say that after reading this book, I'm convinced that Kaplan did the best he could.
Right. So,
You know, I mean, he was what he was.
talk in your mic. We're recording this, remember? Yeah.
Did you get that?
I'm taking photos now, so we're still recording.
So what I'd like us to do, I'm going to put a microphone on the table. I'll start with Dan over here. And everybody just read one and pause and give everybody a minute to take it in. And you'll see how totally inconsistent Kaplan is when he talks about God.
Just remember, Sandy, consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative.
Right.
Thanks, Dave.
And when you use the microphone, hold it close to you.
God is the power that makes for salvation.
God is the power that makes for freedom.
God is that aspect of mind which gives one the courage to live.
God is not being, but reality viewed as ordered universe.
In a discussion with the president of Hebrew Union College, I made my position clear to him that while I believed in God as a transcendent being, I could not conceive of that being having any meaning for us except through and in terms of human experience.
Okay, I have to interject here. He was having this interview because they were considering hiring him at Hebrew Union College. He didn't get the job.
What job was he applying for?
Faculty teaching.
I find myself at present believing in God as the living universe. God is all that there is.
We must give up the habit of thinking of God as a being, absolute, perfect, omnipotent, standing outside of the universe. God is the universe viewed as a living, organic reality.
God in his essence is transcendent. As such, he represents the mystery which we cannot help sensing behind the phenomena of the cosmos. Through his attributes, however, he is immanent. The ethical implications of religion are derived from God as immanent. The attributes of God are simply aspects of reality which are inferred from the attitude of worthwhileness with which we face life. When we face it in a spirit of religion and moral responsibility.
It is because God is to me the warm personal element in life's inner urge to creativity and self-expression that I can conscientiously employ the name Yahweh when praying.
Jewish life calls for our identifying as God. Whatever experienced fact or process enables us to feel at home in the world and to live wisely. So long as a Jew will not rest content unless some experienced fact or process stands out in his mind as so all-significant that it is identified with God and becomes an incentive to his giving the best that is in him and to his enduring the worst that may befall him, he is fulfilling the sine qua non of Jewish life.
I know very well what I mean by God. God to me is the process that makes for creativity, integration, love, and justice.
The only kind of religion that can help us live and get the most out of life will be the one which will teach us to identify as divine or holy, whatever in human nature or in the world about us enhances human life.
God is the sum of everything in the world that renders life significant and worthwhile, or holy. God is the totally of those forces in life that render human life worthwhile.
God is a power that impels people to become fully human.
God is the sum of the animating, organizing forces and relationships which are forever making a cosmos out of chaos.
God is the power that makes for the fulfillment of all valid ideals.
We cannot conceive of God anymore as a sort of invisible Superman, displaying the same psychological traits as people, but on a greater scale. We cannot think of God as loving, pitying, rewarding, or punishing.
God is natural, transnatural, not supernatural. We cannot, for example, believe that God performs miracles and at the same time believe in the uniformities of natural law demanded by scientific theory.
God is the process by which the universe produces persons, and persons are the processes by which God is manifest in the individual.
A God that makes a difference in one person's life should be designated as a personal God.
Reactions? Yes, Linda.
I'm just wondering, reading all these things, why did he need to call it God? Why is it God? What did he need that for? All of this has to do with being kind, being good, being creative, being loving, being the best you can be. Why did he have to name it? That's my question.
As Dorothy just said, maybe because that's always been part of religion, and God was out there, the idea of God is out there. So he struggled with what it was.
I think we have to cut him a lot of slack on this. You know, like I say, I think he did the best he could. I think for him to have conceived of something, okay, it is the power that makes for the fulfillment of all valid ideals, was just out of the question for him. You know? And it's a problem. You know, I mean, it's been a problem for me ever since I've known about this. But, okay, we studied the book. Like I say, he did the best he could. And to tell you the truth, I think it's up to us to go beyond it. Okay, I think we really need to, you should pardon the expression, transcend Kaplan. Or some of us, okay? For, you know, I'll just speak for myself, okay?
You mean we're evolving?
We're developing, we're changing, okay? Evolving seems to, you know, hint that there's some design involved or something like that. And it's not. Evolution, design, development, change happens, okay? 1,000 years from now, we'll look back and say, wow, B'nai Havara, those people were evolved. But you can't say that the weather's getting colder and so I'm going to have to grow more hair, okay? If I had more hair, I would survive for the next season and maybe procreate, and maybe the next, you know, after 1,000 or 1,000,000 iterations, the next area that I am.
I was just going to say, Kaplan was excommunicated for what he did right, you know, even using the word God at that time.
Yeah.
Who excommunicated him?
Well.
Repeat the question. What did you excommunicate him? Repeat the question.
Yeah, Spinoza was excommunicated in 16 something or other. And that was an extreme excommunication he lied down across the threshold of the synagogue. Everybody in the threshold stepped over him on the way coming into
That
the
was
synagogue.
Spinoza.
What?
That was
Spinoza, yes, yeah,
He
yeah.
stepped
On him? That's even better.
Right.
And he was prohibited from having any contact with a member of the Jewish community, I think including his family and whatever, and, you know, I don't know how honest he was with that, but that's what it was. With Kaplan's, his excommunication came from an association of ultra-Orthodox rabbis in New York who were especially upset with the prayer book that Kaplan and his buddies published in 1945, where they changed stuff, they changed wording to delete the references to chosen people or change the references. They did some very important things. These rabbis were very upset. This is 1945, May or April of 1945. You remember the pictures of the Nazis burning books in Germany? These rabbis burned Kaplan's books, 1945. Now, like I say, it was only that small group of rabbis, but some of his colleagues at Jewish Theological Seminary took it seriously, and they shunned him. And Kaplan originally, I don't think, took it very seriously, but he was hurt by it.
Pat?
Just a lot of these quotations are from his journal, which he kept faithfully. I think he intended people to see it eventually. But in his lifetime, he was working things out. He was doing what you do in a daily journal. And I wonder if he meant at least a little, when we finally did get to see it, to give us permission to do the same thing. To work it out and to express what these ideas are for us now, with the understanding that they might be different next week, and it's okay. Because you're dealing with something so vastly greater than you are.
And nothing stays the same.
Right. And I might say, at the time we put this together, we only had the first volume of his journal had been published. Second volume has been published now. I don't have it yet. And I'm sure if we went through his books, we would find many other statements about what God is. Because he was constantly struggling with it, trying to understand.
And the statements on the second side of the sheet are statements that come from his books. So they're out there.
Those are some of them. Okay, Steve?
And you said, when you said God is the process versus God as the process, it's the as the process that you're talking about, Kaplan. Is an as the process.
Well, that's how the phrase was originally promoted.
Which way?
But he's also said, there is written places that quotes from him where he says God is the process that makes for salvation. And originally it was that's something that God was to be viewed or defined as the process, the power that makes for salvation.
And what does salvation? You may have spoken about it.
Come back next week. Priscilla's going to tell you all about salvation.
Without stepping on toes, it has to do with fulfillment.
Right. Yes.
I don't know how to say this without insulting, but given our services and the emphasis on God, how Reconstructionist are we?
That's a very good question.
I'm insulted.
Actually, he's not insulted at all.
And when you helped us with Robbie experiments, we spoke of oneness, not God.
Right, right.
And I find our services, speaking of God, almost anthropomorphic. And I'm insulted. to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what else to say.
You know, we're not a monolithic community. And I think there's a reluctance on the part of the people working on the committees to really take that extra step. Okay? You know, if it was up to me, I would do it, but you know, I mean, we're designing services that, except for the small number of us that are insulted by this, okay, I'd say probably most of the language of the service, I don't know, I'll just say it's just floating out there.
It seems to me when we began to be Reconstructionists, we studied Reconstructionism. My sense is that a lot of people in our community haven't done that.
That's true.
And
Sandy's saying that when you were you one of the founders? Were you?
no, I came at the same time you did.
So, oh, that's right, yeah, so early on, okay? It was important for people coming into the Reconstructionist Scarborough Road to study Reconstructionism, okay? To know what it's all about. There are many different aspects to it. And that was very important. And so when Bobby and I went through orientation, it took place over a period of months, reading some pamphlets from the national organization and discussing them in a small group that was called an orientation group, and eventually progressed into a chavurah. But that's how we did it. Now, you know, things happen, okay? You know, you have to have, I'll say, the leadership that pushes that sort of effort. We get people now who won't even attend like a 2-hour session on orientation for Reconstructionism. They're not interested. I don't know what they are interested in, you know, and you know, we should be insisting on it probably. You know, I'll just make that political statement.
That is a political statement.
That's a political
statement. But I think we have grown, and I think the interest that we see here, people are interested in learning more about Reconstructionism. And while the God language is in the prayer book that we use now, I think a lot of us, I don't want to say the word offended, I'm not offended, but I can take it metaphorically and historically and not literally. So,
the liturgy is a cultural heritage.
Exactly.
And the liturgy has changed periodically according to the needs of the individual groups that use the liturgy. And Reconstructionists are no different. Now, maybe the changes that have been made are not sweeping enough, but nevertheless, the liturgy is part of our cultural heritage. And we can believe in it to the extent that we want to, but it is still part of the cultural heritage. And that's why we use it. It also provides us an opportunity to study sources, or to read sources, the Bible reading every week, as measures of what our cultural heritage is, and in certain places, what our ethics are, because those are brought out. And so the liturgy does not have to be revolutionized. But I think that we have to be cognizant of what our feelings are as we practice.
Adina.
I think some of our cultural heritage belongs...
I'm going to give you the microphone so folks can hear you.
Thank you. I think some of our cultural heritage belongs in a museum. As a woman, I do not feel joyous when I go to Prague and see the thick wall of between the women's section in the back with the tiny arc-like windows through which women could see, couldn't see, and they're barred even. The whole position of women in traditional Orthodox Judaism is something that I think, and even now we are speaking of God as He is the movement of, the energy of the universe, or, whatever. I also, none of these quotes are after 1931. You say he published his book in 45?
Prayer book.
Prayer book.
What? His prayer book. Did he have any reaction to the horror of the Shoah? I mean, in terms of his view of how the world was organized?
That'll be discussed on week 4.
Come back.
I have a question on this anthropomorphic part. I know for sure, that resonates for me. The anthropomorphic approach not only makes a gender mistake, but makes, in my belief, a larger mistake. And there is a translation of every parsha of the Torah that does translate it with a non-anthropomorphic rule. It's in the Chumash. It's in the book, the Hirsch version, the one that I was taught down the street at BMH. It's still used in a lot of places.
The Hirsch Chumash?
Well, no, yeah, in the stuff right next to the Hebrew, there is what is in Aramaic, and many of the words are the same. And it is specifically a non-anthropomorphic translation, and it is 2,000 years old, and it is halachically required to still read it every week. That's why it's in that book. In fact, this is something I've been studying for quite a while. Rabbi Wagner wrote a translation of this whole thing with another person. It was the biggest piece of work of his life. And I have this argument even at the BMH with the rabbi in public in a class like this, that you are hiding the truth when you talk about God saying, doing, God's never called anybody, not said it in anything. God is not a man. And when you say that in an Orthodox context, everybody agrees. And then they say, well, it's just to talk about it because it's really, you can't talk about it otherwise. Well, of course you can. So my question is, did you used to have a less anthropomorphic way of talking about the Torah?
Yeah, actually, before the Reconstructionist movement published the prayer books, this community had loose leaf services, and they were a lot less anthropomorphic. I'd like us to move on because we're getting near the end, and I want you to hear Kaplan's own voice. Okay? Very few people would call Kaplan a poet. Just look at the picture on the cover of this book. Okay, does that look like a warm, fuzzy poet kind of guy? Not. He's stern, he's serious. Last week we learned that he was unhappy most of his life. At least that's what children. Years ago, there was a book published by the Reconstructionist Press. This was published in 1956. It was called Questions Jews Ask, Reconstructionist Answers. And it gathered together a bunch of columns that Kaplan had written. He wrote this for the Reconstructionist magazine throughout the 1950s. And they were responses to questions that had been addressed to Kaplan during lectures that he gave. And when he gave lectures, he insisted that people write their questions down in advance so that he could then respond to the questions. They put all of these together and they published them, did them first on those old records, vinyl records, and then they did CDs, and I got the CD set. Earlier we mentioned that Kaplan believed that God was manifest in the order of nature. So somebody asked him a question about that. Bear with me, it'll take a minute to get it up on the CD, but then you'll hear what he had to say about that.
Rabbi Kaplan, does God manifest himself in the order of nature?
Of course. However, instead of formulating the affirmative reply in the cold language of philosophy, I shall quote from the Reconstructionist Sabbath prayer book, a meditation called God, the Life of Nature. Our fathers acclaimed the God whose handiwork they read in the mysterious heavens above and in the varied scene of earth below, in the orderly march of days and nights, of seasons and years, and in the checkered fate of man. Meantime, have the vaulting skies dissolved. Night reveals the limitless caverns of space, hidden in the light of day, and unfolds horizonless vistas far beyond imagination's ken. The mind is staggered, yet soon regains its poise, and peering through the boundless dark, orients itself anew by the light of distant suns shrunk to glittering sparks. The soul is faint, yet soon revives, and learns to spell once more the name of God across the newly visioned firmament. God is the oneness that spans the fathomless deeps of space and the measureless eons of time, binding them together in act as we do in thought. He is the sameness in the elemental substance of stars and planets, of this our earthly abode, and of all that it holds. He is the unity of all that is, the uniformity of all that moves, the rhythm of all things, and the nature of their interaction. God is the mystery of life, enkindling inert matter with inner drive and purpose. He is the creative flame that transfigures lifeless substance, leaping into ever higher realms of being, brightening into the radiant glow of feeling, till it turn into the white fire of thought. And though no sign of living thing break the eternal silence of the spheres, we cannot deem this earth, this tiny speck in the infinitude, alone instinct with God. By that token which unites the worlds in bonds of matter, are all the worlds bound in the bond of life. God is in the faith by which we overcome the fear of loneliness, of helplessness, of failure, of death. God is in the hope which, like a shaft of light, cleaves the dark abysms of sin, of suffering, and of despair. God is in the love which creates, protects, forgives. His is the spirit which broods upon the chaos men have wrought, disturbing its static wrongs and stirring into life the formless beginnings of the new and better world.
Okay, that is in the Sabbath prayer book that we have now. Yeah.
The whole thing?
Sandy?
Yes, the whole thing.
It's a meditation.
It's a meditation. Yes.
I just wanted to do a plug for those of you who feel strongly about these issues. The synagogue is going to revise the Kol Nidre service this year, which involves a study group and the active writing of liturgy. And some of the people in this room have worked on such projects in the past. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it's wonderful. So if you're interested, please let Becky know or let me know, because if we don't have your voices, then it's not going to turn out in the literature. So somebody's got to do it if you want to see it on the page.
It's actually such a long process that we are starting the study here in another few weeks for 2019 to have a finished product. Because I think Rabbi Yvette felt like they needed a little bit more time.
Right, it's not a rush job.
It's not a rush job.
And Sandy, great job.
Thank you.